Richard Hayes, a 35-year-old widowed CEO, struggles to raise his 7-year-old autistic son Daniel alone after losing his wife in an accident 2 years ago. During a park outing, Daniel has a meltdown and starts crying uncontrollably. Then appears Tommy, a 9-year-old homeless boy, who approaches with a makeshift toy cart and, with extraordinary patience, manages to calm Daniel through silent games and gentle gestures. Impressed, Richard jokes, "If you can make my son stop crying, I'll give you anything you want." Tommy smiles shyly and responds, "I just wish I had a dad and a brother like you have each other." This answer shatters Richard's heart, prompting him to investigate the boy's story. The shocking discovery will change their lives forever. Tommy is his biological son from a previous relationship he never knew existed. If this story touches your heart, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. The October sun cast long shadows across Riverside Park as Richard Hayes pushed Daniel's wheelchair along the familiar concrete path. At 35, Richard had learned to navigate the world of single fatherhood with the same precision he applied to running his tech company. But days like today tested every ounce of his patience and resolve. Daniel, his 7-year-old son, had been unusually quiet during their afternoon outing. The boy's autism meant that changes in routine or unexpected stimuli could trigger overwhelming episodes, and Richard had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the warning signs. Today, however, the meltdown came without notice. It started with a whimper, then escalated to full-blown screams that echoed across the playground. Other children stopped their games to stare, while their parents shot uncomfortable glances in Richard's direction. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others whispered among themselves with thinly veiled judgment. "It's okay, buddy," Richard whispered, kneeling beside Daniel's wheelchair and trying to apply the gentle pressure techniques their therapist had taught him. "Daddy's here. Everything's going to be fine." But Daniel's cries only intensified. His small fists pounded against the wheelchair's armrests, while tears streamed down his flushed cheeks. Richard felt that familiar knot of helplessness tighten in his chest, the same feeling that had consumed him 2 years ago when Sarah died in that terrible car accident, leaving him to raise Daniel alone. The other families began packing up their things, clearly uncomfortable with the disruption. Richard considered doing the same when a small voice broke through Daniel's wails. "Hey there, little guy." Richard looked up to see a boy, no more than 9 years old, approaching cautiously. The child's clothes were dirty and several sizes too large, held together with safety pins in places where seams had given way. His dark hair was unkempt, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who had seen far too much for his age. In his hands, he carried a makeshift toy cart constructed from cardboard and bottle caps. "I don't think," Richard began, his protective instincts kicking in. But something extraordinary happened. The homeless boy sat down cross-legged on the ground, eye level with Daniel's wheelchair, and began rolling his cardboard cart back and forth in slow, rhythmic motions. He made soft vroom sounds, completely unbothered by Daniel's continued screaming. Within minutes, Daniel's sobs began to subside. His eyes, still wet with tears, focused on the simple toy moving in predictable patterns. The boy continued his gentle play, occasionally making the cart perform small jumps or spin in careful circles. "That's amazing," Richard breathed, watching his son's breathing slowly return to normal. The homeless boy looked up with a shy smile that revealed a missing front tooth. "My name's Tommy. I like cars too." He held out the cardboard cart toward Daniel, who reached out tentatively to touch it. Richard felt a lump forming in his throat as he watched the interaction. This stranger, this child who clearly had nothing, had accomplished in 5 minutes what Richard sometimes couldn't manage in hours. "Tommy," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know how to thank you. Tommy shrugged, still focused on entertaining Daniel. It's okay, mister. Sometimes people just need a friend. The simple wisdom in those words hit Richard like a physical blow. Here was a child who had every reason to be angry at the world, yet he approached others with nothing but kindness and understanding. "Tell you what," Richard said, attempting to lighten the mood while his heart swelled with gratitude. "If you can keep my son calm for another 10 minutes, I'll give you anything you want." He meant it as a joke, a way to acknowledge the boy's incredible gift, but Tommy's response stopped him cold. The boy looked up from the cart, his young face suddenly serious. "Anything." "Sure, buddy, anything at all." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, and Richard could see him wrestling with something internal. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I just want what you and Daniel have." "What do you mean?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "I want a dad and a brother, like you two have each other." He looked down at his hands, now still on the cardboard cart. "I've been alone for so long, and seeing you take care of him. I just wish someone cared about me like that." The words hit Richard with the force of a tsunami. His successful businessman facade crumbled as he stared at this brave little boy who had asked for the one thing Richard couldn't simply write a check for. The one thing that required opening his heart again after he'd spent 2 years building walls around it. "Tommy," Richard said softly, "how long have you been on your own?" "Since I was 6. Tommy replied matter-of-factly. "My mum, she got really sick and couldn't take care of me anymore. I've been staying in different places, but mostly I sleep in the park." Richard's mind reeled. This child had been surviving on the streets for 3 years, yet he still possessed enough compassion to help a stranger's son through a difficult moment. "What about your father?" Richard asked gently. Tommy's face darkened. "My mom never told me who he was. She said he didn't know about me and probably wouldn't want me anyway." The playground had grown quiet around them. Daniel had fallen asleep in his wheelchair, exhausted from his emotional episode, while Tommy continued to guard the makeshift cart as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Richard made a decision that would change everything. "Tommy, what's your last name?" "Rodriguez," the boy answered. "Tommy Rodriguez." Richard pulled out his phone and quickly typed a note to himself. He had resources, connections, and more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. If this child needed help, Richard would move heaven and earth to provide it. But as he looked at Tommy's hopeful face, something nagged at the back of his mind. The boy's features, now that Richard really studied them, seemed familiar somehow. The shape of his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw. "Tommy, what's your mother's name?" "Was," Tommy corrected quietly. "She died last year. Her name was Maria Rodriguez." The phone slipped from Richard's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering onto the concrete path. Maria Rodriguez. The name hit him like a freight train, dragging with it memories he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself they never happened. 9 years ago, before Sarah, before Daniel, before he'd become the man he was today, there had been Maria. A brief but intense relationship during his wild phase in college. Ended when she moved away without explanation. He'd tried to contact her for months afterward, but she'd vanished completely. Eventually, he'd assumed she'd simply moved on, maybe found someone else. He'd never imagined. Richard stared at Tommy with new eyes, seeing past the dirt and ragged clothes to the familiar features beneath. The boy had his nose, his stubborn chin, even the small dimple in his left cheek that Richard saw every morning in the mirror. "Tommy," Richard whispered, his voice shaking, "when's your birthday?" "January 15th, Tommy replied, puzzled by the strange question. Richard did rapid calculations in his head, 9 years ago plus 9 months. The timeline fit perfectly. Richard's hands trembled as he knelt in front of Tommy, studying every detail of the boy's face with new eyes. The resemblance was undeniable now that he was looking for it, the same dark hair that stuck up at odd angles, despite any attempt to tame it. The same green eyes that Sarah used to say could see straight through to someone's soul. "Tommy," Richard said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you remember your mother ever mentioning someone named Richard? Or maybe Rick?" Tommy's brow furrowed in concentration. "She used to talk about someone called Richie sometimes, when she was really sick. She'd say his name when she was having her fever dreams." The boy's voice grew softer. "She said he was the only man who ever made her feel safe, but that she had to protect me from getting hurt." The words sent shockwaves through Richard's system. Maria had been protecting Tommy from him, but why? He'd loved her deeply during their time together, and while their relationship had been intense and sometimes turbulent, he'd never given her reason to fear him. "Did she ever show you any pictures?" Richard asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Tommy shook his head. "She didn't keep pictures of anything from before I was born. She said the past was too painful to remember." He tilted his head, studying Richard with those eerily familiar green eyes. "Why are you asking me all these questions?" Richard looked over at Daniel, still sleeping peacefully in his wheelchair, then back at Tommy. How could he possibly explain what he suspected without sounding completely insane? How could he tell this child that he might have found his father in the most impossible of circumstances? "I knew someone named Maria Rodriguez a long time ago," Richard said finally. "She was very special to me." Tommy's eyes widened. "You knew my mama?" "I think I might have." Richard pulled out his wallet and withdrew a small photo he'd kept hidden behind his business cards for 9 years, a picture of him and Maria at a college football game, her arms wrapped around his waist, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. "Does this look like your mother?" Tommy took the photo with reverent hands, his fingers tracing over his mother's young face. "That's her," he breathed. "That's my mama when she was happy." His eyes darted to Richard in the photo, then back to the man kneeling before him. "And that's you?" "Yes," Richard said, his throat tight with emotion. "That's me." The implications hung in the air between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Richard's mind raced through possibilities and explanations, but one fact kept circling back. The timing was perfect, the resemblance was striking, and Maria had kept his name locked away in her heart until the very end. "Tommy, I need to ask you something very important," Richard said, placing gentle hands on the boy's thin shoulders. "Would you be willing to come with Daniel and me, just for today, so I can make sure you have a safe place to sleep and something to eat?" Tommy's expression grew guarded. "Are you going to call social services?" "Because I've been in foster homes before, and some of them, they're not very nice places." Richard's heart broke a little more. "No social services, I promise. I just want to help, and I think we need to figure out some things about your family history." "What kind of things?" Richard took a deep breath. There was no easy way to say this. And Tommy deserved honesty even if the truth seemed impossible. "Tommy, I think there's a chance, just a chance, that I might be your father." The words hung in the autumn air like leaves waiting to fall. Tommy stared at Richard with wide eyes, the photo of Maria still clutched in his small hands. "My father," Tommy whispered. "I can't be sure without some tests, but the timing fits and you look so much like I did when I was your age." Richard pulled out his phone and showed Tommy a picture of himself from his childhood. "See the resemblance?" Tommy studied both photos, his young mind working to process this life-altering possibility. "If you're my dad," he said slowly, "why didn't you come looking for me?" The question was like a knife to Richard's heart. "Because I didn't know you existed, buddy. Your mama never told me she was pregnant. If I had known—" His voice cracked. If I had known, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." Tommy was quiet for several long minutes, his gaze alternating between the photos and Richard's face. Finally he asked, "If you are my dad, does that mean Daniel would be my brother?" "Yes," Richard said. "It would mean you two are half-brothers." Tommy looked over at the sleeping boy in the wheelchair, his expression softening. "I've always wanted a brother, someone to take care of. You know, like you take care of Daniel. You'd be wonderful with him," Richard said, and he meant it. Tommy's natural patience and gentle spirit with Daniel had been extraordinary to witness. Can I stay with you while we figure this out?" Tommy asked hesitantly. "Just until we know for sure?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. But first, we need to get you cleaned up, fed, and maybe see about getting you some new clothes that actually fit." Tommy's face lit up with the first genuine smile Richard had seen from him. "Really? You'd do all that, even if the tests say you're not my dad?" "Tommy," Richard said firmly, "regardless of what any test says, you've already done something amazing for my family today. You helped my son when I couldn't, and you did it with such kindness and patience. That makes you special to us, no matter what." As they prepared to leave the park, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had been orchestrated by forces beyond his understanding. The coincidence seemed too perfect, too impossibly timed. But as he watched Tommy carefully adjust Daniel's blanket with the same protective instincts Richard felt for his son, he began to believe in miracles again. The drive to Richard's house was filled with Tommy's amazed whispers as he took in the luxury sedan's interior. Daniel had woken up and was content to hold Tommy's hand while the older boy pointed out interesting sights through the window. "Is that really where you live?" Tommy gasped as they pulled through the electronic gates of Richard's estate. "It's where we live," Richard corrected gently, not missing the significance of his word choice. "At least for now." That evening, after Tommy had showered and changed into some of Daniel's older clothes that were still too big but cleaner than anything he'd worn in months, Richard tucked both boys into beds in adjoining rooms. Tommy had insisted on staying close to Daniel, already displaying the protective instincts of an older brother. As Richard stood in the doorway watching Tommy read a picture book to Daniel, he whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had brought them together. Tomorrow would bring DNA tests and difficult conversations about custody and legal matters. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, his house felt like a complete home again. The last thing Richard saw before turning off the lights was Tommy's small hand reaching across the space between the beds to hold Daniel's. 2 boys who had found in each other exactly what they'd been missing. But Richard had no idea that the truth about Tommy's past would prove even more complicated and heartbreaking than he could imagine. The next morning brought chaos that Richard hadn't anticipated. Tommy woke up screaming from a nightmare at 4 a.m., his cries echoing through the large house and waking Daniel, who became agitated by the unfamiliar sounds and routine disruption. Richard found himself running between 2 bedrooms, trying to comfort both boys, while his housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, stood in the hallway, looking overwhelmed. "Tommy, you're safe," Richard said, sitting on the edge of the guest bed where the 9-year-old was curled into a tight ball, his thin body shaking. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." "The man was chasing me again," Tommy sobbed. "He had the needle and he said Mama owed him money. And when she couldn't pay..." Richard's blood ran cold. "What man, Tommy?" But the boy just shook his head, unable or unwilling to elaborate. Instead, he looked toward Daniel's room, where they could hear the 7-year-old's distressed sounds. "Daniel needs you," Tommy said, immediately putting aside his own trauma to focus on someone else's needs. Richard was struck again by Tommy's incredible maturity and selflessness. "He needs both of us," Richard replied, offering his hand to Tommy. "Want to help me calm him down?" Together, they went to Daniel's room where the autistic boy was rocking back and forth in his bed, overwhelmed by the disruption to his carefully structured world. Tommy immediately went to the toy cart he'd brought from the park, now clean and sitting on Daniel's dresser. "Hey, Daniel," Tommy said softly, beginning the same rhythmic rolling motion that had worked yesterday. "Look, the car wants to go for a morning drive." Within minutes, Daniel's distress began to ease. Richard watched in amazement as Tommy seemed to intuitively understand exactly what his son needed, displaying a patience and connection that even trained therapists had struggled to achieve. "How do you do that?" Richard asked quietly. Tommy shrugged. "I guess I understand what it's like to feel scared and confused. Sometimes people just need to know someone cares enough to stay calm with them." The wisdom in those words from a 9-year-old's mouth left Richard speechless. After breakfast, Richard made the calls he'd been dreading. First, to his lawyer about temporary guardianship papers, then to a private investigator he'd used for corporate matters. "I need everything you can find on Maria Rodriguez," he told the PI over the phone while the boys played in his home office. "She would have lived in the city about 9 to 10 years ago, possibly moved away suddenly. I also need you to locate any medical records for her son, Tommy Rodriguez, born January 15th. "This sounds personal, Mr. Hayes," the investigator noted. "It is, and I need it fast, within 48 hours if possible." The afternoon brought their appointment with Dr. Sarah Chen, the pediatrician who had cared for Daniel since birth. Richard had called ahead to explain the unusual circumstances, and Dr. Chen had agreed to see Tommy for a full medical evaluation and coordinate the DNA testing. Tommy was nervous about seeing a doctor, his small hand gripping Richard's tightly as they sat in the waiting room. Daniel, surprisingly, seemed calmer with Tommy present, as if the older boy's protective presence gave him additional security. "What if the test says you're not my dad?" Tommy whispered as they waited to be called back. Richard knelt down to meet Tommy's eyes. "Then we'll figure out what comes next together. But Tommy, I want you to know something important. Family isn't just about DNA. Family is about people who choose to love and take care of each other. Like how you take care of Daniel even when it's hard." "Exactly like that." Dr. Chen was gentle and patient during Tommy's examination, but her expression grew increasingly concerned as she documented old injuries and signs of prolonged malnutrition. "Richard, I need to speak with you privately," she said, after completing the initial assessment. In her office, Dr. Chen's voice was grave. "This child has been through significant trauma. I'm seeing evidence of old fractures that healed improperly, dental issues from poor nutrition, and what appears to be scarring from injection sites on his arms." "Injection sites?" Richard's heart sank. "Possibly from medical treatment. But given his history of living on the streets," she left the implication hanging. "I'm also concerned about his psychological state. He's exhibiting signs of hypervigilance and has several stress responses typical of children who've experienced abuse." Richard felt sick. What does he need? Stability, proper nutrition, consistent medical care, and probably trauma therapy. The good news is that children are resilient, and with the right support system, he can recover from this. "He'll have whatever he needs," Richard said without hesitation. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued. "Based on his medical history and the timeline you've given me, I'd say there's a strong possibility he is your biological son. The bone structure, the way he carries himself, even some of his mannerisms, they're remarkably similar to yours." That evening, Richard called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. He spent the day introducing Tommy to what would hopefully become his new routine. Breakfast together, educational activities with Daniel, playground time, and structured meals. Tommy soaked up every moment of attention like a plant that had been dying of thirst. He asked endless questions about Daniel's condition, about Richard's work, about the house and its rooms. but he also shared more details about his life with Maria and their struggles after she became ill. "Mama worked 3 jobs to take care of me," Tommy said as they sat by the fireplace that evening. "She cleaned offices at night, worked at a diner during the day, and sometimes did laundry for people on weekends. But when she got sick, she couldn't work anymore." "What kind of sick?" Richard asked gently. "Cancer," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "She tried to hide it from me for a long time, but I could tell she was getting weaker. Toward the end, she talked a lot about wanting to find my dad, but she was scared." "Scared of what?" Tommy was quiet for a moment. "She said my dad was successful and important, and she didn't want him to think she was just trying to get money from him. She said she'd rather handle everything herself than risk me getting rejected." The words hit Richard like physical blows. Maria had been dying, struggling to raise their son alone, and she'd been too proud or too afraid to reach out for help. If only he'd tried harder to find her after she disappeared. If only he'd known. "She loved you very much," Richard said, pulling Tommy closer on the couch while Daniel dozed between them. "I know," Tommy said simply, "and I think she would have liked you taking care of me now." And that night, as Richard tucked both boys into their beds, Tommy asked the question that had been haunting Richard's thoughts all day. "If you really are my dad, does that mean I don't have to leave? Does that mean I can stay and be Daniel's brother forever?" Richard's throat tightened with emotion. "If I'm your dad, Tommy, you're never leaving. This will be your home, and Daniel will be your brother, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the 9 years I missed." "And if you're not my dad?" Richard looked into those green eyes that were so much like his own and made a promise that came from the deepest part of his heart. "Then I'll adopt you anyway, because you already feel like my son." Tommy's smile was brighter than any light Richard had ever seen. But neither of them knew that the DNA results would reveal complications that would threaten to tear their newly formed family apart before it had truly begun. The DNA results arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier in a plain manila envelope that seemed far too ordinary to contain information that would change 3 lives forever. Richard stared at the envelope for nearly an hour before opening it, his coffee growing cold as Tommy and Daniel ate breakfast at the kitchen island. Tommy had been with them for 6 days now, and the transformation in all their lives was remarkable. Daniel had experienced fewer meltdowns, seeming calmer and more secure with his new brother nearby. Tommy had gained weight and color in his cheeks, and the haunted look in his eyes was beginning to fade under the influence of regular meals, safety, and unconditional love. Richard had already contacted his lawyers about emergency custody procedures, regardless of what the DNA test revealed, but his heart hammered as he finally opened the envelope and unfolded the laboratory report. The words swam before his eyes as he read the conclusion. "Based on genetic analysis, Richard Hayes is excluded as the biological father of Tommy Rodriguez with 99.99% certainty." The paper slipped from Richard's fingers and fluttered to the kitchen floor. "Daddy?" Daniel's voice cut through Richard's shock. "Sad?" Richard looked up to find both boys staring at him with concern. Tommy's face had gone pale, and Richard realized the boy could read the devastation in his expression. "The test results came back," Richard said quietly, his voice hoarse. Tommy slid off his bar stool and walked over to pick up the fallen paper. Though he couldn't understand all the scientific terminology, the word excluded was clear enough. "You're not my dad," Tommy said in a small voice. "Tommy, it's okay," the boy said quickly, but Richard could see tears forming in his eyes. "I kind of figured it was too good to be true. I mean, what are the chances, right?" Richard knelt down and pulled Tommy into a fierce embrace. "Listen to me very carefully, Tommy Rodriguez. That piece of paper doesn't change anything about how I feel about you or what I want for our family. But if I'm not really your son, you are my son," Richard said firmly. Maybe not by DNA, but by every single thing that matters. You're Daniel's brother, you're part of this family, and I'm going to adopt you officially just like I promised. Tommy pulled back to look at Richard's face. Really? Even though we're not actually related? Especially because we're not actually related, Richard said. Do you know what that means, Tommy? It means I'm choosing you. Not because I have to, not because of biology, but because I want you to be my son. The tears Tommy had been holding back finally spilled over. I want that too, he whispered. Richard held both boys close, Daniel patting Tommy's back with the instinctive gentleness he'd developed around his new brother. But even as they comforted each other, Richard's mind was racing. The resemblance between him and Tommy was undeniable. How could the DNA test be so conclusive when the physical similarities were so strong? That afternoon, while the boys napped, Richard called Dr. Chen to discuss the results. I have to admit, I'm surprised, she said after reviewing the report. The physical similarities are really quite remarkable. Are you certain about your relationship with Maria Rodriguez? Absolutely certain, Richard replied. We were together for 8 months, and the timing would have been perfect for Tommy's birth. Well, DNA doesn't lie, Dr. Chen said thoughtfully. But there are rare cases of laboratory error. If you have any doubts, we could run the test again with a different lab. Richard was about to respond when his other line rang. His private investigator's name appeared on the screen. Dr. Chen, I need to call you back. My investigator is calling with information about Maria. Richard, you need to sit down for this, the PI said without preamble. I found Maria Rodriguez's medical records, and there's something you need to know about Tommy's birth. What kind of something? Maria was treated at St. Mary's Hospital during her pregnancy for severe complications. According to her records, she had a condition called placenta previa that required her to be hospitalized for the last 2 months of her pregnancy. Okay, that's tragic, but I don't see how... Richard, she was hospitalized from November 15th through January 15th, Tommy's birth date. But here's the thing. Her emergency contact during that time was listed as Eduardo Martinez, and he's listed as Tommy's father on the original birth certificate. Richard's world tilted. What? Eduardo Martinez was Maria's boyfriend after you two broke up. According to hospital records, he was present for Tommy's birth and signed the paternity acknowledgement. Tommy's birth certificate lists Eduardo Martinez as his father, not father unknown, like Tommy thought. But the timing gets more complicated, the investigator continued. I found Eduardo Martinez. He lives about 30 miles outside the city. Has been married for 6 years and has 3 kids. And Richard, he looks exactly like Tommy. The phone nearly slipped from Richard's hands. What do you mean exactly? I mean, if you put them side by side, you'd think Tommy was Eduardo's clone. Same nose, same jaw, same green eyes, even the same way of tilting his head when he's thinking. Richard's mind reeled. If Eduardo was Tommy's father and looked so much like the boy, then the resemblance Richard had noticed between himself and Tommy was coincidence, he whispered. There's more, the investigator said. Eduardo's been looking for Tommy for over a year. After Maria died, the boy disappeared from the foster system. And Eduardo's been working with social services to find him. He never stopped paying child support, even after Maria died. Richard felt like he was drowning. Are you telling me that Tommy has a father who's been looking for him? A father who wants him back, yes. But here's where it gets complicated. Eduardo doesn't know that Tommy's been living on the streets. Social services told him Tommy was placed with a stable foster family out of state. They've been lying to him for months. The implications hit Richard like successive waves of devastation. Tommy wasn't his son. Tommy had a biological father who wanted him, and that father had been searching for him while Tommy suffered alone on the streets due to bureaucratic incompetence. Richard, There's something else you should know about Eduardo Martinez. Richard braced himself for another blow. He's not in a position to take Tommy right now. 6 months ago, Eduardo was diagnosed with early-stage multiple sclerosis. His condition is manageable, but the stress of his illness combined with his wife's difficult pregnancy, she's due next month with twins, has made their home situation pretty chaotic. So Tommy's father is sick and dealing with a family crisis, Richard said slowly. It seems like the universe has a twisted sense of timing, the investigator agreed. Eduardo wants his son back, but he's not sure he can provide the stability Tommy needs right now. Meanwhile, you've fallen in love with a boy who isn't biologically yours, but desperately needs exactly what you're offering. After hanging up, Richard sat in his home office for a long time, staring at the DNA results and processing this new information. Through the window, he could see Tommy and Daniel playing in the backyard, their laughter drifting through the glass. Tommy wasn't his son, but the boy had become essential to Richard's happiness and Daniel's well-being in just 6 days. How could he explain to 2 children who had finally found stability and love that their newfound family was built on a mistaken assumption? And how could he explain to Tommy that somewhere out there was a biological father who had been desperately searching for him? Richard made a decision that would require more courage than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. He was going to call Eduardo Martinez and arrange a meeting, because sometimes doing the right thing meant risking everything you just found. The restaurant Richard chose for the meeting was neutral territory, a quiet family place on the outskirts of town where they could talk without attracting attention. He arrived 30 minutes early, his stomach churning with anxiety as he replayed the conversation he'd had with Eduardo Martinez over the phone. Eduardo had been shocked to learn that Tommy was safe and living with Richard, but his relief had quickly turned to confusion and then protective anger when he'd learned about the circumstances. "You're telling me my son has been living on the streets for over a year while social services told me he was in a good foster home," Eduardo had said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Richard had replied. "The system failed him completely. And now you want to keep him?" The question had hung in the air between them like a challenge. Richard had taken a deep breath before answering. "I want what's best for Tommy, but Eduardo, in 6 days, that boy has become part of my family. He's bonded with my son, he's thriving in our home, and he's already been through so much trauma. I think we owe it to him to figure out the best solution together." Now, as Richard sat in the restaurant booth nursing his second cup of coffee, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. What if Eduardo simply demanded Tommy back? What legal rights did Richard have to a child who wasn't biologically his? At exactly 2 p.m., a man walked through the restaurant entrance, and Richard's heart sank. The investigator had been right. Eduardo Martinez looked so much like Tommy it was startling. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same stubborn jawline. But where Tommy was thin from malnutrition and hardship, Eduardo was clearly a man who worked with his hands, broad-shouldered and strong, despite the slight tremor in his left hand that spoke to his recent MS diagnosis. Eduardo spotted Richard immediately and approached the table with determined strides. Richard Hayes. Eduardo's voice carried a slight Hispanic accent that Tommy's didn't have, probably lost during his years on the streets. "Eduardo, thank you for coming." Richard stood to shake hands, noting Eduardo's firm grip and direct gaze. They sat across from each other, 2 men who loved the same boy, trying to figure out how to navigate an impossible situation. "Tell me about Tommy," Eduardo said without preamble. "How is he really?" Richard spent the next hour describing Tommy's condition when he'd found him, the nightmares, the signs of trauma and malnutrition, but also the incredible resilience and kindness the boy had shown. Eduardo listened with tears in his eyes, his hands clenched into fists as he processed what his son had endured. When Richard finished, Eduardo was quiet for a long moment before speaking in a voice thick with emotion. "I want to see him." The drive back to Richard's house was tense. Both men lost in their own thoughts about the confrontation ahead. Eduardo stared out the passenger window, his hands trembling slightly. Whether from his MS or from nervousness, Richard couldn't tell. When they pulled through the electronic gates, Eduardo's eyes widened at the mansion's impressive facade, and Richard saw him calculate the vast difference between what he could offer Tommy versus the luxury the boy was experiencing now. They found Tommy and Daniel in the living room, building an elaborate fort out of couch cushions and blankets. The moment Tommy looked up and saw Eduardo, his face went completely white, and the toy blocks he'd been holding clattered to the floor. "Papa," Tommy whispered, the Spanish words slipping out unconsciously. Eduardo's composure cracked completely, and he dropped to his knees with his arms open wide. Tommy ran across the room and threw himself into his father's embrace, both of them sobbing as 9 months of separation and fear melted away in that single moment. Richard watched from the doorway, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously as he realized that sometimes love meant letting go, even when it destroyed you to do it. The reunion between Tommy and Eduardo lasted nearly an hour, father and son clinging to each other as if afraid the other might disappear. Richard watched from the doorway, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously as he witnessed the raw emotion unfolding before him. Daniel, confused by the sudden intensity, retreated to his wheelchair and began rocking slightly. "I looked everywhere for you, mijo," Eduardo whispered in Spanish, his hands cupping Tommy's face. "Every day I called social workers, drove to different cities, posted your picture everywhere. I never stopped looking. They told me you didn't want me anymore," Tommy replied, his voice muffled against his father's shoulder. "After Mama died. They said you signed papers to give me up." Eduardo's face darkened with fury. "That's a lie. I never signed anything except papers to get you back. I've been paying child support, working with lawyers, doing everything they asked to prove I could take care of you." Richard felt anger at the system that had failed this family so completely. But his attention was drawn to Daniel, who was becoming increasingly distressed by the emotional chaos. "Tommy," Richard said softly, "Daniel needs you." Tommy immediately pulled away from Eduardo and went to his brother, kneeling beside the wheelchair and beginning the gentle, rhythmic motions that always calmed Daniel. Eduardo watched in amazement as his son demonstrated the same patient understanding with Daniel that he'd always shown with other children. "You're good with him," Eduardo observed. "Daniel's my brother," Tommy said simply. "He needs people who understand that his brain works differently, and that's okay." Eduardo looked at Richard with new understanding. "He's bonded with your son." "They've bonded with each other," Richard replied. "Tommy has been incredible for Daniel's development, and Daniel has given Tommy something he's never had before, someone who needs him." They spent hours talking while the boys played together. Eduardo shared his story, how he'd dated Maria after her relationship with Richard ended, how he'd fallen in love with both her and her unborn child, how he'd stepped up to be Tommy's father regardless of paternity. "I never cared if Tommy was biologically mine," Eduardo said, watching his son arrange blocks for Daniel. "From the moment he was born, he was my son, period." Eduardo also explained his current situation, the MS diagnosis, his wife Carmen's difficult pregnancy with twins, the financial strain of medical bills and reduced work hours. "I want Tommy back," Eduardo said firmly. "But I have to be honest. Right now, my house is chaos. Carmen is on bed rest. I'm dealing with fatigue from the MS, and we're preparing for 2 newborns." "What are you suggesting?" Richard asked. Eduardo watched Tommy and Daniel together. "Maybe Tommy needs to stay here a little longer while I get my situation sorted out, but I want to be part of his life. I want him to know his papa never stopped loving him. That evening, Richard had the hardest conversation of his life with Tommy. "How are you feeling about seeing your papa again?" Richard asked as they sat on Tommy's bed. "Confused," Tommy admitted. "I'm happy he's been looking for me, but I'm scared too. Scared that if I go with him, I'll lose Daniel, and I'll lose you. But I'm also scared that if I stay here, Papa will think I don't love him anymore." Richard pulled Tommy close. "Listen carefully, buddy. No matter what happens, you will always be Daniel's brother. Always. And you will always be my son, too. Love doesn't disappear because people live in different houses." But it's not the same," Tommy whispered. "No, it's not the same. But Tommy, your papa loves you, and he's been fighting for you. Don't you think you owe it to yourself to see if you can rebuild that relationship?" Tommy was quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked, "What would you do if you were me?" Richard's throat tightened. "I would try to keep an open heart and see what feels right." But none of them were prepared for the crisis that would test their newfound family bonds in the most unexpected way. 3 weeks into their new arrangement, everything seemed perfect. Tommy spent weekdays at Eduardo's house, getting reacquainted with his father and stepmother Carmen, while helping prepare for the twins' arrival. Weekends were at Richard's house, maintaining his bond with Daniel and continuing the stability that had helped him heal. For 3 weeks, the system worked beautifully. Tommy thrived in Eduardo's modest but warm home, where Carmen treated him like her own son, and Eduardo made up for lost time with bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. Daniel counted down the days until Friday, when his brother would return. Everything changed the night Carmen went into premature labor. The call came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Richard answered his buzzing phone to find Eduardo's name on the screen. "Richard, I need your help." Eduardo's voice was tight with panic. "Carmen's at the hospital. The babies are coming early, too early. And Tommy. Tommy saw everything. The blood, the emergency, the paramedics. He's completely shut down." Richard was already getting dressed. "Where is he now?" "In the hospital waiting room. He won't talk, won't let anyone touch him. He's just sitting there rocking back and forth like Daniel does when he's overwhelmed." "I'm on my way." Richard had Mrs. Patterson stay with Daniel and drove to the hospital faster than he'd ever driven. He found Tommy exactly as Eduardo had described, sitting in a corner chair, rocking slightly with his arms wrapped around his knees, staring at nothing. "Tommy," Richard said softly, approaching slowly. "It's Richard. I'm here." No response. Tommy's eyes were glassy and unfocused, and Richard recognized the signs of a traumatic episode. The boy had retreated deep inside himself, probably reliving memories of his mother's illness and death. Richard sat on the floor next to Tommy's chair and began talking in the same calm, rhythmic tone Tommy used with Daniel. "Carmen and the babies are going to be okay," Richard said, even though he didn't know if that was true. "The doctors are taking very good care of them." Still no response, but Richard thought he saw Tommy's rocking slow slightly. "Daniel wanted me to tell you something," Richard continued, pulling out his phone to show Tommy a video. "He made this for you." On the screen, Daniel was sitting with his toy cart, rolling it back and forth in the soothing pattern Tommy always used. "Tommy, brother," Daniel said to the camera, "always safe, always love." A single tear rolled down Tommy's cheek, and his rocking stopped. "He's right, you know," Richard said softly. "You're always safe with us, all of us. Eduardo, Carmen, Daniel. And me, we're all your family now." Tommy finally turned his head to look at Richard. "Is Carmen going to die like Mama did?" Richard's heart clenched. "No, buddy. Carmen is young and strong, and she's getting the best medical care possible." Over the next hour, Richard slowly coaxed Tommy back to the present. When Eduardo finally emerged from the delivery area, exhausted but smiling, he found Tommy curled up in Richard's lap. "How is she?" Richard asked quietly. Tired, but okay. The twins are small but healthy, 5 pounds each, a boy and a girl. Eduardo's eyes filled with tears. Maria and Carlos, we named them after Tommy's mother and my father. Tommy stirred at the sound of his mother's name. The babies are named Maria. One of them is, Eduardo said, kneeling down. Your little sister Maria and your little brother Carlos. Would you like to meet them? Tommy straightened up with a sense of purpose that transformed his entire demeanor. They're really here. They're really my brother and sister. They're really here, Eduardo confirmed, and they're really small, so they need their big brother to help protect them. Tommy looked at Richard. Can Daniel come meet them too? I want them to know they have another brother. I think that can be arranged, Richard said, his throat tight with emotion. But it was during one of these visits that Richard overheard a conversation that would change everything forever. A week after the twins came home, Richard overheard Tommy talking to Carmen in the living room while he helped Eduardo prepare bottles in the kitchen. I think I need to stay here all the time now, Tommy was saying quietly. The babies need me, and Papa's hands shake sometimes when he's tired, and you're still recovering from surgery. Tommy, sweetie, you don't have to take care of everyone, Carmen replied gently. But I'm good at it, Tommy insisted, and Daniel has Richard to take care of him, but the babies only have Papa. And Papa has the sickness that makes him weak sometimes. Richard's heart broke as he realized what Tommy was doing. The 9-year-old was making an adult decision to sacrifice his own needs for his family's well-being, just as he'd been doing since he was 6 years old. Eduardo must have heard too, because when Richard looked at him, the man's face was etched with pain and guilt. He's choosing us, Eduardo whispered, but he's doing it because he thinks we can't manage without him. That's not a choice a 9-year-old should have to make, Richard replied. That night, Richard lay awake for hours, wrestling with a decision that would require more courage than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. By morning, he knew what he had to do. The conversation with Daniel proved easier than expected, though heartbreaking in its simplicity. His 7-year-old son listened carefully as Richard explained that Tommy's new family needed extra help. Tommy's sad if babies cry too much? Daniel asked. Tommy might be worried about the babies, yes, and about his papa, who is sick sometimes. Daniel was quiet for several minutes, then rolled his wheelchair over to his toy box and pulled out the cardboard cart Tommy had brought from the park that first day. Give Tommy, Daniel said, holding out the cart. For new babies. Daniel, that's Tommy's special toy. Make new one together, Daniel replied with unusual clarity. Tommy teach babies like teach Daniel. That afternoon, Richard called Eduardo and Carmen and asked if he could come over for a serious conversation. When he arrived, he found Tommy on the living room floor, carefully feeding baby Maria while Carlos slept nearby. I have a proposition, Richard said once they were all gathered, and I want everyone to hear it, including Tommy, because it affects all of us. Tommy looked up from the baby, suddenly worried. Are you changing the weekend arrangement? Actually, I'm thinking we need to change everything. Richard interrupted gently. Tommy, you shouldn't have to choose between your families. And Eduardo, Carmen, you shouldn't have to struggle with 2 newborns and Eduardo's health issues while trying to give Tommy the attention he deserves. What are you suggesting? Eduardo asked cautiously. Richard took a deep breath. I'm suggesting that you all move in with Daniel and me. The room fell silent, except for the soft sounds of the babies. Carmen's eyes widened, Eduardo's mouth fell open, and Tommy stared at Richard as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. Move in with you? Carmen repeated. I have an 8-bedroom house, with most of the rooms sitting empty. Richard said, there's a full apartment over the garage that could be perfect for your family. Eduardo, you could cut back work hours without worrying about finances. Carmen, you'd have help with the twins. Tommy wouldn't have to choose between families. "Richard," Eduardo said slowly, "that's incredibly generous, but we can't accept—" "Why not?" "Because of pride. Eduardo, you spent 9 months searching for your son while I accidentally found him. You've been dealing with illness while preparing for twins. I have resources that could help." "But what's in it for you?" Carmen asked. Richard looked at Tommy. "Because that little boy changed my life and my son's life in ways I can't explain. Because Daniel has never been as happy as when Tommy's around, and because family isn't about blood or legal documents. It's about people who choose to love each other." Tommy carefully placed baby Maria in her bassinet and walked over to Richard. "You really want us all to live together, like one big family?" "I really do," Richard said. "If that's what everyone else wants, the decision would reshape all their lives in ways none of them could imagine." 6 months into their blended family arrangement, Richard thought they had weathered the worst adjustments. The twins were thriving. Eduardo's MS was well managed with reduced stress. And Tommy had found perfect balance between his two fathers. Daniel had made remarkable progress, largely due to Tommy's guidance and the stimulation of having babies in the house. Their harmony shattered on a Tuesday morning when a social worker appeared at Richard's door with a court order and police escort. "Mr. Hayes," the woman said, showing credentials, "I'm Margaret Walsh from Child Protective Services. We've received reports that you're housing a child who was never legally placed in your custody." Richard's blood ran cold. "Tommy is with his biological father. Eduardo has full parental rights. Mr. Eduardo Martinez does not have legal custody of Thomas Rodriguez," she replied crisply. "The child was removed from his previous foster placement due to abuse allegations and was supposed to be transferred to a specialized facility. Instead, he disappeared from the system." "That's impossible," Richard said. "Tommy wasn't in foster care when I found him. He was homeless. According to our records, Thomas Rodriguez was placed with the Morrison family 18 months ago. When bruises were discovered and he made abuse allegations, he was scheduled for emergency removal. But he ran away before social services could complete the transfer." Richard felt the world tilt. Tommy had never mentioned the Morrison family. The boy had told them he'd been on the streets since his mother died. There must be some mistake. "No mistake. I have a court order for immediate removal of Thomas Rodriguez to state custody pending full investigation." Through the windows, Richard could see Tommy and Daniel playing in the backyard while Eduardo helped Carmen with the twins. Their peaceful family scene was about to be destroyed. "Can I at least speak with him first?" Margaret Walsh's expression softened slightly. 10 minutes. But Mr. Hayes, if there's any resistance or attempt to hide the child, you'll be charged with harboring a runaway minor." Those 10 minutes felt like 10 seconds. Richard called everyone into the living room and tried to explain as gently as possible, but there was no way to soften the blow. Tommy's face went white. "They're taking me away again?" "We're going to fight this," Eduardo said immediately. "Tommy, you're my son. I have rights." "Apparently not legal ones," Richard said grimly, showing them the court papers. "According to this, Tommy's custody was never officially transferred to Eduardo." "But the Morrison family," Tommy whispered, and Richard saw terror in his eyes. "Mr. Morrison, he hurt me. That's why I ran away." Carmen gasped and pulled Tommy into a protective embrace. "What kind of hurt, sweetheart?" Tommy shook his head, unable to elaborate, but the haunted look in his eyes told Richard everything he needed to know. "We'll get a lawyer," Richard said firmly. "We'll fight this through proper channels." "No," Tommy said quietly. "I can't go through that again. I can't sit in courtrooms while people decide what happens to me, like I'm not even real." Daniel, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation, suddenly rolled his wheelchair over to Tommy and took his brother's hand. "No go," Daniel said with unusual force. "Tommy, stay. Family." "I don't have a choice, Daniel," Tommy replied, his voice breaking. "Always choice," Daniel insisted. Then, to everyone's amazement, he looked directly at Margaret Walsh and said, "Bad people hurt Tommy. Good people here. Tommy's safe here." As they prepared for Tommy to leave with Margaret Walsh, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Tommy," he said, kneeling down to meet the boy's eyes, "I want you to remember something very important. We're going to bring you home. Not maybe, not hopefully. We are going to bring you home." "What if the courts don't see it that way?" Tommy asked. "Then we'll appeal. And if that doesn't work, we'll keep fighting. Because you're not just Eduardo's son or my son, you're our son, and we don't give up on our children." Tommy threw his arms around Richard's neck. "I love you, Dad," he whispered. The word Dad hit Richard like lightning. Tommy had never called him that before. "I love you too, son," Richard whispered back. As Margaret Walsh led Tommy toward the door, Daniel called out in the clearest speech Richard had ever heard from him. "Tommy, remember, always brother, always family, always come home." The real fight was just beginning. The war to bring Tommy home consumed 8 weeks of their lives. Richard hired the best family law attorney in the state, Janet Morrison, who specialized in fighting bureaucratic incompetence and protecting children's rights. "This case is a perfect storm of systemic failure," Janet explained. "Tommy fell through every crack in a system supposedly designed to protect him. But that actually works in our favor. We can argue the state has proven its inability to act in his best interests." Eduardo petitioned to re-establish his parental rights, a humiliating process requiring him to prove his fitness as a father all over again. Richard filed for legal guardianship, while Carmen provided character testimony about Tommy's integration into their family. Tommy was placed in a group home, a sterile institutional environment that was safe, but emotionally devastating for a boy who had finally learned what family love felt like. Richard and Eduardo were allowed supervised visits twice a week, heartbreaking encounters in a stark conference room where they tried to maintain Tommy's spirits while working through legal strategies. "How's Daniel?" Tommy asked during every visit. "He misses his brother," Richard would reply honestly. "He keeps asking when you're coming home." Daniel had regressed significantly since Tommy's removal. His meltdowns increased, his verbal communication decreased, and he'd stopped playing with most toys except the cardboard cart he and Tommy had made together. The breakthrough came during week 6. Janet called Richard with barely contained excitement. "We found her," she said. "We found the social worker who was supposed to handle Tommy's case when he first entered the system after Maria's death." "What does that mean?" "It means we have proof that someone falsified records. Linda Chen was the assigned caseworker, but she was fired 3 months ago for taking bribes from foster families who wanted to avoid having difficult children placed with them." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "The Morrison family paid Linda Chen $5,000 to have Tommy reassigned to them instead of to Eduardo, who was already in the process of regaining custody. They wanted the state support money, but didn't want to deal with his behavioral issues. So when Tommy reported abuse, Chen covered it up to protect her criminal activity. When the bruises became too obvious to ignore, she scheduled Tommy for removal, but tipped off the Morrisons. That's why Tommy was able to run away. They let him go rather than face charges. The implications were staggering. Tommy had been deliberately placed with abusive people as part of a corruption scheme, then abandoned when he tried to protect himself. What does this mean for our case? It means we're going to court tomorrow morning. And I'm going to demand Tommy's immediate return to your custody pending resolution of the permanent placement hearings. The next morning, the courtroom was packed with everyone who had come to love Tommy. Richard, Eduardo, Carmen with the twins, Daniel in his wheelchair, Mrs. Patterson, even Dr. Chen, who provided medical testimony. Judge Patricia Williams listened to 3 hours of testimony about corruption, falsified records, and systemic failures. She reviewed medical reports documenting Tommy's trauma recovery, educational assessments showing his academic progress, and psychological evaluations confirming his emotional stability in their care. But it was Daniel's testimony that sealed the case. The 7-year-old had never spoken to strangers before, had never handled the stress of unfamiliar environments. But when Janet called him to the witness stand, Daniel's voice rang out clear and strong. "Tommy is my brother," Daniel said, looking directly at Judge Williams. "He teaches me things. He helps when I'm scared. Family needs Tommy. Tommy needs family." The judge ruled in their favor, and Tommy came home that very afternoon to a house full of people who had never stopped fighting for him. 5 years later, Richard stood in the backyard, watching an extraordinary scene unfold before him. Tommy, now 14 and taller than Richard remembered being at that age, was patiently teaching 5-year-old Carlos how to ride a bicycle, while 12-year-old Daniel offered encouraging words from his wheelchair. 5-year-old Maria was building an elaborate sandcastle with Eduardo, whose MS remained stable thanks to excellent medical care and a stress-free environment. Carmen emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of lemonade, her belly round with their 4th child, a pregnancy that had surprised everyone but delighted the whole family. At 38, Richard had never imagined he'd be helping to raise 5 children, but he couldn't picture his life any other way. "Remember when you thought Tommy might be your biological son?" Carmen said, settling into a chair beside Richard with a contented sigh. "DNA doesn't make family," Richard replied, a phrase that had become their household motto. "Love makes family." "Speaking of which," Tommy called out, jogging over after successfully teaching Carlos to balance on 2 wheels, "I have news." At 14, Tommy had grown into a remarkable young man. He maintained perfect grades while helping care for his younger siblings, volunteered at a local center for autistic children, inspired by his work with Daniel, and had recently been accepted into an exclusive summer program for gifted students. "What kind of news?" Eduardo asked, looking up from the sandcastle. "I got the letter today," Tommy said, his eyes bright with excitement. "I've been accepted to the early admission program at MIT, full scholarship." The backyard erupted in cheers and congratulations. Richard felt tears prick his eyes as he watched Eduardo sweep Tommy into a proud embrace, while Daniel clapped enthusiastically from his wheelchair. "MIT at 16. Richard said, shaking his head in amazement. "Your mother would be so proud. Both my mothers would be proud." Tommy corrected with a meaningful look at Carmen, who had tears streaming down her face. "And both my fathers." Later that evening, after the younger children were in bed, Richard found Tommy sitting on the porch steps where they'd had so many important conversations over the years. "Having second thoughts about MIT?" Richard asked, settling down beside him. "Not second thoughts," Tommy said slowly. "Just wondering how everything worked out so perfectly. I mean, what are the odds? Me ending up in that park, Daniel having a meltdown at exactly the right moment, you being there to witness it all?" Richard smiled, remembering his own amazement at the series of coincidences that had brought them together. Maybe it wasn't coincidence at all. Maybe it was meant to happen exactly the way it did. "You really believe that?" "I believe that sometimes the universe conspires to bring people together who are supposed to be family. Look at us. We're not related by blood. We didn't plan this. We barely knew each other existed. But somehow, we all ended up exactly where we belong." Tommy was quiet for a moment, then said, "I used to dream about having a family. When I was living on the streets, when I was in bad foster homes, when I was scared and alone, I used to imagine what it would feel like to have people who loved me unconditionally. And my dreams were never this good. Tommy said with a laugh. "I never imagined having two fathers who would move heaven and earth for me, a stepmother who treats me like her own son, siblings who think I hung the moon, and a brother like Daniel who taught me that love comes in all different forms." "Speaking of Daniel," Richard said, "he has something he wants to give you before you leave for MIT. Tommy looked puzzled as Richard called Daniel out onto the porch. The 12-year-old rolled his wheelchair over, carrying a carefully wrapped package. "For Tommy," Daniel said, his speech much clearer now after years of therapy and patient encouragement from his big brother. "For college." Tommy unwrapped the gift to find the original cardboard cart from the park, the one that had started everything. But Daniel had carefully reinforced it with wood and metal, turning it into a beautiful, permanent keepsake. "Daniel made this himself," Richard explained. "He's been working on it for months in Eduardo's workshop." Tommy's eyes filled with tears as he examined the intricate craftsmanship. "Daniel, this is incredible." "Always remember," Daniel said, looking directly into Tommy's eyes with the clear, focused gaze that he'd developed over the years. "Always remember how we found each other. Always remember that love makes family." "I'll never forget," Tommy promised, pulling Daniel into a fierce hug. "How could I forget the day my little brother saved my life?" As Richard watched his two sons embrace under the porch light, he reflected on the miracle that had transformed all their lives. They had started as strangers, thrown together by chance, but they had chosen to become something extraordinary, a family built not on blood or law, but on love, loyalty, and the unshakable belief that everyone deserves to belong somewhere. The homeless boy in the park had been looking for a father and a brother. Instead, he had found something even more precious. He had found home, and in saving Tommy, they had all saved each other.